Welcome to today's reading from Brilliant as the Sun, a retelling of Srimad Bhagavatam Canto 4. We're going to begin chapter 13 today, Dhruva's Descendants. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Maitreya names Dhruva's descendants and describes how one of them, King Anga, had a wicked son named Vena. Maitreya and Vidur walked over to the shade of a banyan tree. Occasionally monkeys overheard chattered, or birds flitted from branch to branch. They passed a large turtle basking on a rock by the lake. Verses 1 to 5. After they were seated, Vidur said, I feel so enriched by hearing about Dhruva. He is such an auspicious personality. I'm curious to know more about the Prachetas whom you mentioned earlier. Maitreya said, What would you like to know? Who were they? In which dynasty they were born? Who were their parents? I would also like to know where they performed their great sacrifice. I know that the great sage Narad is the greatest of all devotees. He has compiled the Pancharatrika procedure for serving the Lord. He has even met Lord Narayan in person. My curiosity about the Prachetas is aroused because you said Narad went to their sacrifice and glorified Dhruva. My dear Brahmin, I would like to know if Narad described any of Vishnu's transcendental pastimes while he was there. If so, please tell me in detail everything he said. Verses 6 to 11. Maitreya said, The Prachetas appear in Dhruva's dynasty. When Dhruva departed for the forest, his son Utkal was reluctant to become the next emperor of the earth. From his birth, he was self-satisfied soul, unattached to worldly pleasures or possessions. He could see how everything in the world is pervaded by and rests on the supersoul. He became liberated from all material contact and fully self-realized. Understanding his eternal identity as the Lord's servant, he wanted nothing more than to serve him. To avoid the company of materialistic people, he pretended to be blind, deaf, and mad. So we're talking about Utkal, son of Dhruva, when Dhruva Maharaj went to forest, who was so renounced. To avoid the company of materialistic people, he pretended to be blind, deaf, and mad. He was actually an advanced soul. But he covered his glories like a fire covered by ashes. Thus foolish people considered him to be ignorant. The family elders, along with the ministers, thinking him mad, enthroned his younger brother, Vatsara, who was son of Dhruva's first wife, Brahmi. Verses 12 to 18, Maitreya gave the names of Vatsara's descendants. After some generations, there was a king named Anga whose son Vena was greatly sinful. Maitreya explained that King Anga, dismayed by Vena's bad character, left his home and kingdom and retired to the forest. Verses 19 to 20, the great sages killed Vena with a curse as powerful as a thunderbolt. In the absence of a monarch, the kingdom was overrun by thieves and plunderers, and the citizens suffered terribly. The sages manifested the next king Prithu, the original monarch, and a partial incarnation of Prithu. The sages manifested the next king, Prithu, the original monarch and a partial incarnation of Vishnu, by mystically churning Vena's dead body. Verses 21 to 24, Vidur said, My dear Brahmin, King Anga was very saintly, gentle, of high character, and a lover of spiritual culture. How did such a great soul beget a son like Vena? Because of whom he abandoned his kingdom. I am also surprised that the great sages, who were all fully conversant with the religious principles, punished Vena. After all, normally it is the king who punishes others. Citizens should never insult the king, even if he appears sometimes to be sinful. Indeed, he is supposed to be the Lord's representative. Above all other rulers, great sage, you are well acquainted with all subjects, both past and future. Since I am your faithful follower, please describe King Vena's history. Smiling, Maitreya began to speak. Verse 25. The melodious sound of Sanskrit mantras reverberated throughout the sacrificial arena. Smoke billowed up as the priests poured ladles of ghee into the fire. Swaha, they cried, as the offerings were made. The chief priest's brow furrowed. The ritual was almost over. Where were the gods? He whispered to his assistant. I cannot detect the Deva's presence. Can you? His assistant shook his head. Verse 26. The chief priest turned to the king on his other side. Great king, we are properly making offerings into the sacred fire, but the gods are not coming. Anga frowned, unable to speak due to his vow of silence for the sacrifice. He merely looked quizzically at the priest. Verse 27, the head priest said, O saintly king, there is no fault with the offerings or with the sacrifice. We know you have arranged everything with great faith and care. We are properly chanting the Vedic hymns. All the priests assisting with this sacrifice are experts in ritual performance. Anga's worried eyes flitted back and forth. Verse 28, the head priest conferred with his assistants. He turned to Anga and shrugged. Dear king, we cannot think of a reason why the gods should feel insulted or neglected. Everything is being conducted properly. We cannot understand why the gods are not accepting the offerings. Verse 29, by the hand signals, Anga requested permission from the priests to break his vow of silence. The head priest consented and king began to speak. My dear great sages, kindly tell me the offense I have committed. Although invited, and gods are neither taking part in the sacrifice nor accepting their shares. Anga sat down in a daze. No sun, that was a calamity. Without an heir, he would be deficient in fulfilling his duties to his ancestors and to his citizens. There would be no one to perform his last rites. Seeing his distressed condition, the priests once again conversed. Verses 32 to 34 now. Finally, after several minutes, the chief priest said, O king, we wish all good fortune for you. Kindly listen to our advice. Execute the sacrifice solely for the pleasure of Lord Vishnu, the Supreme Person. If you satisfy him, then he will certainly reciprocate, because Vishnu is the supreme enjoyer of sacrifice. When he accepts your invitation, then all the gods will also come with him and take their shares. Your desire for a son will then be fulfilled, dear king. It is always fruitful to directly worship Lord Vishnu, for he quickly responds to those who seek his shelter. Verses 35 to 37. Anga's face lit up. Please proceed immediately. The priests took their places and began offering oblations while chanting hymns for the pleasure of Vishnu, addressing him as the super soul in everyone's heart. As soon as the oblations were offered, an effulgent person appeared from the fire. He wore a golden garland and was dressed in white. He carried a golden pot filled with rice boiled in milk. After receiving permission from the head priest, Anga accepted the pot, and in great delight he respected the sacred food by sniffing its aroma. He turned and glanced at his beautiful wife Sunita. She was begotten by Death himself. Was it befitting that she partake of this sanctified food? Sunita looked expectantly at her husband. He smiled and offered her the pot. How could he deny her a son? Okay, Verses 38 to 42 now. Soon after, Sunita became pregnant, and in due course, a son named Vena was born. Anga arranged for him to be schooled by Brahmins, but to his great consternation, it's spelled as Consternation. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. Consternation, Vena was inclined to act irreligiously, following in the mood of his grandfather death. The boy developed a dark and sinister character, excessively cruel and vindictive. He would take pleasure in the gratuitous killing of animals. Always angry, he stormed about the kingdom, and when anyone saw him, they would hide, fearful that he would attack them for no reason. Merciless, Vena even killed his own playmates without the least compunction. His father punished him with increasing severity, but the boy would not be rectified. Verses 43 to 45. After one particular unhappy incident, King Anga became despondent. Restless, he paced up and down, pondering what to do. People with no son were certainly fortunate. They must have worshipped Lord Vishnu in previous lives so that they could be spared the unbearable suffering caused by a bad son. He destroys the family's reputation, causes arguments between his parents, and generally creates endless anxiety. No thoughtful person wants such a worthless son who simply perpetuates one's future bondage in the material world, while simultaneously making one miserable in the here and now. The king spent most of the day in his temple praying for guidance. Verse 46. As the night descended, his heart lightened. In many ways, a bad son was better than a good one. A man who has good son becomes attached to his home and family life. A bad son, however, creates such a hellish home that any intelligent man naturally becomes detached. Verse 47. That night he tossed and turned. Unable to sleep, he glanced over at Sunita, who slept soundly next to him. What was the point of staying here? He was old, better he retire. There was no pleasure left in ruling the kingdom or enjoying with his wife. Anga rose, wrapped a shawl around his shoulders, and slipped silently out of the palace, unseen by anyone, heading for the forest. Verses 48 to 49. The next day the king could not be found. His ministers questioned the queen. Had he told her where he was going? She shook her head. The ministers consulted learned Brahmins. Did they know anything? The Brahmins knew how disgusted Vena was with his family life. They suggested he might have renounced his kingdom and gone to the forest. When the citizens heard their king might have left them, they became greatly aggrieved. People formed such parties, penetrating deep into the forest. They were intent on finding the king and begging him to return. After several days of futile search, they returned to the kingdom. The chief minister and court priests summoned the greatest sages of the land. When they arrived, all the citizens went to the palace. Tearfully, they offered obeisance to the sages and informed them of their inability to find the king anywhere. So this brings us to the end of chapter 13, Dhruva's Descendants. And next time we'll begin chapter 14, King Vena's Great Arrogance. It's a beautiful lesson that even in bad circumstance we can get our blessings if we look at them. For example, it was cited here in the verses that having a bad son can also be good, because that will make the person renounce from the material attachment and will encourage them towards the devotional path of life. Because if somebody has got a very, very good son or daughters, I would say, because we are talking about the rulers here. The rulers, they wanted to have a son so their kingdom could carry on. But if the family life is too good, sometimes that is also going to not encourage people towards a devotional service. But we know that about the temporary existence in this life. So we do our duties, perform what is desired because of our situation in life. We have to, but never forget the Lord and keep ourselves focused to live our lives with Lord in center of our existence and our daily life. Thank you for joining. I wish you all a blissful day ahead. Hari Om Tat Sat. Hare Krishna.